On a cold Thursday night in Manhattan, billionaire CEO Daniel Whitmore picked up a Mont-Blanc pen and laughed while signing away 27 years of marriage. The sound echoed softly through the private conference room on the 43rd floor of Whitmore Global Tower, a place built almost entirely from his ego. Outside the glass walls, rain washed over the city in silver streaks while traffic crawled below like veins carrying electricity through the heart of New York. Daniel believed this night marked the beginning of freedom. Freedom from the woman he called emotionally exhausting. Freedom from the routines of marriage. Freedom from the quiet wife who had stood beside him long before private jets, luxury penthouses, and magazine covers transformed him into one of the most powerful men in American finance. Across the table, Eleanor Whitmore sat in complete silence, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression unreadable beneath the soft amber lights hanging above them. Daniel mistook that silence for defeat. That was the first mistake that would eventually destroy him. 3 floors below the law office, inside the marble lounge of the Whitmore building, 29-year-old Vanessa Kane checked her reflection in the dark screen of her phone while waiting for Daniel to finish the divorce. She had spent the last 2 years becoming the newest obsession of a man old enough to remember the stock market crash of 1987. To Daniel, Vanessa represented youth, excitement, and proof that he still controlled the world around him. He had already promised her a villa in Italy, a yacht in Miami, and a future untouched by responsibility. In his mind, the divorce papers were nothing more than the final receipt for a life he no longer wanted. But there was one thing Daniel Whitmore failed to notice while grinning at the signature line in front of him. Hidden deep inside the holding company structure attached to Appendix C was a clause placed there almost 14 years earlier during the restructuring of Whitmore Global's international assets. A clause Daniel himself had approved during one of his sleepless expansion years, when billion-dollar acquisitions blurred together like airport terminals and whiskey glasses. He never reread the paperwork. He never imagined he needed to, because the woman sitting quietly across from him was the same woman he had stopped paying attention to a very long time ago, and Eleanor Whitmore already owned half of everything. The moment Daniel signed the final page, Eleanor slowly slid the documents toward the attorney without saying a word. No tears, no trembling voice, no emotional breakdown, just silence. The kind of silence that usually appears seconds before an avalanche collapses down a mountain. Daniel leaned back into his leather chair and loosened his tie with visible relief. To him, it was over. To Eleanor, it had only just begun. Within 72 hours, Daniel Whitmore would lose voting control of Whitmore Global. Within 5 days, federal regulators would freeze several offshore transactions connected to the company's European division. Within 2 weeks, members of his own executive board would turn against him publicly. And before the month ended, the same business magazines that once called him the king of Wall Street logistics would begin asking a completely different question. How did one of the most feared CEOs in America lose everything to the woman he spent years underestimating? Phones would start ringing before sunrise. Lawyers would rush through Manhattan carrying sealed documents worth billions. Financial reporters would gather outside Whitmore Tower like vultures circling fresh wreckage. Vanessa Kane would disappear from public view after leaked emails exposed her involvement in company decisions she was never legally allowed to influence. Federal investigators would quietly enter the building through a private underground entrance, while employees pretended not to stare. And somewhere inside all the chaos, Daniel Whitmore would finally realize something that terrified him far more than losing money. Eleanor had been preparing for this moment for years. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. For most of the country, Daniel Whitmore was the definition of American success. Financial magazines called him ruthless but brilliant. Business networks described him as the architect behind one of the largest logistics empires in North America. Politicians shook his hand in public and criticized him in private. Employees feared him. Investors trusted him. Competitors avoided crossing him unless they had no other choice. By the age of 58, Daniel Whitmore had transformed Whitmore Global from a struggling regional freight company into a multinational powerhouse worth nearly $11 billion. His face appeared on magazine covers beside headlines celebrating discipline, leadership, and relentless ambition. But people who worked closely with Daniel often described him differently once cameras disappeared. They spoke about a man obsessed with control down to the smallest detail. Meetings could last 6 hours because Daniel disliked the placement of a single sentence inside a presentation. Executives were fired over hesitation. Assistants learned quickly that silence was safer than disagreement. He expected loyalty from everyone around him while offering almost none in return. Somewhere along the way, success stopped being enough for Daniel Whitmore. Control became the only thing that mattered. And then there was Eleanor Whitmore. For nearly 3 decades, she existed beside Daniel like a shadow the public barely noticed. She rarely attended interviews, rarely appeared at corporate events, rarely gave speeches. Most people outside Whitmore Global knew almost nothing about her except what gossip columns repeated every few years. Elegant, reserved, private. The quiet billionaire's wife. Employees often described her as polite but distant. Investors dismissed her entirely. Younger executives inside the company sometimes joked that Eleanor looked more like a retired librarian than the wife of one of America's most feared CEOs. Daniel encouraged that perception without realizing how dangerous it would eventually become. During interviews, he referred to Eleanor as supportive. At charity galas, he introduced her with the detached warmth of a man describing furniture he'd owned for years. By the final years of their marriage, many people inside Whitmore Global privately assumed Eleanor no longer had any involvement in the company at all. They were wrong, terrifyingly wrong. Because while Daniel spent years commanding attention in public, Eleanor spent those same years quietly learning every weakness hidden inside the empire they built together. She knew which board members secretly hated Daniel. She knew where the offshore accounts were buried. She knew which executives manipulated quarterly reports before shareholder meetings. She knew which senators Daniel bribed with donations disguised as consulting fees. And unlike Daniel, Eleanor listened carefully when people underestimated her. That habit would eventually become the most expensive mistake of his life. Then there was Vanessa Cole, 31 years old, sharp, ambitious, and impossible to ignore. Officially, Vanessa worked as Daniel Whitmore's executive assistant. Unofficially, nearly everyone inside Whitmore Global understood the real nature of their relationship long before the divorce papers appeared. Vanessa moved through the executive floors with the confidence of someone who believed her future had already been secured. She attended private meetings she technically had no clearance to enter. Senior employees noticed Daniel consulting her before longtime executives. Rumors spread quietly through the company like smoke under a locked door. Some claimed Vanessa controlled Daniel emotionally. Others believed Daniel simply enjoyed having someone younger admire him again. Either way, Vanessa's influence inside Whitmore Global grew rapidly during the final years of Daniel's marriage, and Eleanor watched all of it without publicly reacting once. That silence became one of the greatest mysteries surrounding the collapse of Whitmore Global. Why did Eleanor stay silent for so long? Why did she tolerate years of humiliation, rumors, and betrayal without publicly fighting back? People would later debate that question endlessly across financial podcasts, cable news interviews, and courtroom discussions. Some believed she was emotionally broken. Others believed she was trapped financially. But investigators examining the collapse of Whitmore Global would eventually discover something much more unsettling. Eleanor Whitmore had never been trapped at all. Then another question emerged. What exactly did Daniel Whitmore sign away that rainy night in Manhattan? At first, the divorce looked ordinary for people of their wealth. Luxury properties, asset divisions, stock agreements, confidentiality clauses. But hidden beneath layers of legal language sat a restructuring mechanism connected to international voting shares Daniel had approved years earlier without reviewing carefully. A mechanism Eleanor quietly protected for nearly 15 years while Daniel focused on expansion, acquisitions, and public attention. By the time he realized what the documents actually meant, the transfer process had already begun. And perhaps the most dangerous question of all was this: why were federal investigators already watching Whitmore Global before the divorce papers were even signed? Because behind the luxury offices, private jets, and billion-dollar acquisitions, federal agencies had quietly started examining unusual financial movements connected to Whitmore Global nearly 8 months earlier. Offshore transfers, missing tax disclosures, suspicious shell corporations tied to foreign subsidiaries. At first, investigators believed Daniel Whitmore was hiding money. What they didn't realize was that someone else inside the company had already been collecting evidence long before they arrived. What Daniel didn't know wasn't just about the divorce. It was about a secret Eleanor had been building quietly for nearly 15 years. Long before private jets carried Daniel Whitmore across continents, and before financial reporters chased him through Manhattan sidewalks asking about billion-dollar mergers, he was just another middle-class kid growing up in Newark, New Jersey, inside a cramped apartment above a failing hardware store his father could barely keep alive. Daniel learned very early that money controlled the temperature of a household. When business was bad, silence filled the apartment like smoke. When bills arrived, arguments followed. By the age of 14, Daniel had already decided he would never live like that again. Former classmates later described him as intense in ways that unsettled people. He remembered every insult, every advantage someone else had, every opportunity he lacked. Teachers praised his intelligence but quietly admitted he treated conversations like competitions he needed to win. One former college roommate would later describe Daniel Whitmore with a sentence that perfectly explained the man he eventually became. Daniel treated every room like a negotiation, even when nobody else realized they were bargaining. That mindset followed him everywhere. While other students partied, Daniel studied corporate acquisitions and memorized investor biographies the way athletes memorized playbooks. He admired powerful men with absolute focus and borrowed pieces of their personalities, until ambition became his entire identity. By 32, Daniel Whitmore had already built the foundation of Whitmore Global from a cramped office above a shipping warehouse in Brooklyn. The company started small: freight coordination, regional trucking contracts, late-night phone calls with exhausted drivers crossing state lines. Daniel worked 18-hour days fueled by caffeine, anger, and the fear of becoming poor again. Early employees remembered sleeping inside the office during financial crises because payroll barely survived month to month. They remembered Daniel screaming at suppliers over pennies while simultaneously pitching million-dollar expansion ideas to investors who laughed at him behind closed doors. But Daniel possessed something many successful businessmen never fully develop. He could sell certainty even when everything around him looked unstable. Investors trusted him because he sounded incapable of failure. Clients trusted him because he made confidence feel contagious. By the late 1990s, Whitmore Global exploded into one of the fastest-growing logistics companies in the Northeast. And standing beside Daniel during all of it was Eleanor Whitmore. Back then, Eleanor didn't look like the quiet billionaire wife tabloids eventually ignored. She was sharp, composed, and frighteningly observant. Former employees who worked with the couple during Whitmore Global's earliest years later admitted something few outsiders ever understood. Eleanor often seemed smarter than Daniel when it came to understanding people. Daniel could dominate a negotiation, but Eleanor could predict one before it even started. She handled the company's finances during its fragile early years, while Daniel chased contracts across the country. She built relationships with lenders after Daniel burned bridges through arrogance. She negotiated Whitmore Global's first major shipping agreement with a Chicago manufacturing firm after Daniel nearly destroyed the deal by insulting their executives during dinner. And during the company's first major recession, when Whitmore Global stood less than 2 weeks away from bankruptcy, it was Eleanor who quietly reorganized the debt structure that kept the company alive. Daniel received the magazine covers afterward. Eleanor received almost no public recognition at all. Friends close to the couple often believed Eleanor intentionally avoided attention. While Daniel enjoyed interviews and public praise, Eleanor preferred remaining invisible. She understood something Daniel never fully appreciated. The person nobody watches closely usually sees everything. Over time, she became less visible inside the company by choice. She stepped away from formal executive roles after their second child was born and focused publicly on family life, charity boards, and private investments. To outsiders, it looked like Eleanor had surrendered her ambitions to support her husband's rise, but people who truly knew her noticed smaller details. She still reviewed quarterly reports late at night. She still attended private strategy dinners when major acquisitions were involved. She still maintained relationships with attorneys, auditors, and international consultants long after officially stepping away from company operations. Daniel slowly stopped noticing those things because success had started changing him in ways even Eleanor could no longer fully control. As Whitmore Global expanded internationally, Daniel became obsessed with growth. Every year needed to be bigger than the last. More acquisitions, more magazine covers, more wealth, more influence. Employees began whispering that Daniel no longer slept more than 4 hours a night. He missed birthdays. Anniversary dinners turned into conference calls. Family vacations became networking opportunities disguised as relaxation. Eleanor adapted quietly the way she always had, but emotional distance slowly settled into their marriage like dust collecting in corners nobody cleaned anymore. Old family videos from that period painted a strange picture when viewed years later. Daniel smiling at charity galas while checking stock updates beneath the dinner table. Eleanor watching him across crowded rooms with an expression difficult to describe. Not sadness, not anger, something colder, something more calculating. Their children noticed the changes too. Former family friends later described dinners where Daniel barely spoke unless conversation involved business. When Eleanor tried discussing personal matters, he redirected attention toward company expansion plans or market forecasts. The marriage didn't collapse all at once. It eroded slowly through neglect so ordinary most people barely noticed it happening. Then came the humiliations Eleanor never publicly addressed. During a private investor dinner in Miami, Daniel interrupted Eleanor mid-conversation and jokingly referred to her as retired from useful work. People laughed because Daniel Whitmore had become the kind of man nobody challenged publicly. Eleanor smiled politely and continued eating. Another time, during an interview with a financial podcast, Daniel described himself as completely self-made despite the fact that Eleanor helped build Whitmore Global from the beginning. She never corrected him, never argued, never defended herself publicly. That silence confused people for years. Some assumed Eleanor lacked confidence. Others believed she was emotionally trapped by wealth and routine. But silence can mean many things. Sometimes silence is surrender. Sometimes it is patience. Vanessa Cole entered the picture gradually, almost carefully, like someone stepping into cold water 1 inch at a time. She joined Whitmore Global officially as an executive assistant after completing a business consulting program in Boston. Attractive, intelligent, and socially skilled, Vanessa learned quickly how to operate around powerful men. Employees noticed Daniel's interest in her long before anything inappropriate became visible publicly. At first, the changes seemed harmless. Vanessa attended more executive dinners than her role required. Daniel praised her ideas during meetings while dismissing suggestions from longtime senior staff. Late-night strategy sessions became common. Private jokes started appearing during boardroom discussions. Vanessa laughed at Daniel's stories with the effortless admiration he no longer received at home. To outsiders, it looked like chemistry. Eleanor noticed something else entirely. She noticed Vanessa gaining access to internal conversations beyond her clearance level. She noticed Daniel forwarding sensitive information through personal channels instead of corporate systems. She noticed how certain executives suddenly became nervous whenever Vanessa entered a room. And most importantly, Eleanor noticed Daniel becoming careless. That carelessness would eventually destroy him, because the real betrayal didn't begin with Vanessa Cole. It began years earlier with a document Daniel Whitmore never thought mattered. The night Daniel Whitmore signed the divorce papers began with rain hammering against the windows of a private dining suite 39 floors above Manhattan. The city below looked blurred beneath sheets of water and gold reflections, as if New York itself had been submerged beneath dark glass. Inside the room, everything felt controlled with surgical precision. Crystal champagne flutes rested untouched beside leather-bound legal folders. A pianist played softly somewhere beyond the hallway. Waiters moved carefully enough to avoid disturbing the tension hanging over the table. Daniel Whitmore preferred environments like this because they made him feel untouchable. Expensive rooms had become armor to him over the years. Across from him sat Eleanor Whitmore, dressed in black, her posture calm, her expression unreadable beneath the low amber lighting. She looked less like a woman finalizing a divorce and more like someone quietly waiting for a delayed train. Daniel interpreted her silence the same way he always had during the final years of their marriage. Compliance, exhaustion, defeat. He could not yet see the difference between surrender and patience. 3 floors below them, Vanessa Cole sat inside the executive lounge of Whitmore Tower with a half-finished glass of wine beside her phone. Every few minutes she checked the time, then glanced toward the private elevator reserved for senior executives. Staff members passing through the lounge recognized her immediately, but avoided eye contact. Rumors about Vanessa and Daniel had already spread through Whitmore Global long before the divorce became official. Some employees pitied Eleanor. Others privately assumed Daniel had simply upgraded his life the same way powerful men replaced cars, homes, and aging business partners once they stopped being useful. Vanessa herself seemed completely certain about the future waiting upstairs. Daniel leaned back comfortably while reviewing the final stack of documents spread across the polished table. To him, this was paperwork. Expensive paperwork, certainly, but still just another transaction to close before moving on with his life. He had already instructed his attorneys to ensure Eleanor received enough money to avoid public sympathy. Multiple properties, monthly settlements, investment accounts. He wanted the divorce resolved quickly, quietly, and without scandal. Daniel hated emotional scenes almost as much as he hated losing control. His attorney carefully summarized final details while Eleanor listened without interruption. Occasionally, she nodded once before returning to silence. That silence slowly began unsettling even the lawyers in the room, because Eleanor never asked emotional questions, never argued over money, never demanded explanations. She simply observed. At one point, Daniel finally looked directly at her and spoke in the calm, rehearsed tone wealthy men often use when convincing themselves they are still decent people underneath their cruelty. "You'll be comfortable," he said while adjusting his cufflinks. Eleanor held his gaze for several seconds before answering quietly. That was never the issue. The room fell silent again after that. Even the attorney stopped turning pages momentarily. Daniel gave a faint smile, as if dismissing her response internally. But something about the way Eleanor said those words stayed with him longer than he expected. For years, Daniel Whitmore believed money solved every meaningful problem. Wealth insulated him from consequences. Influence buried scandals before they surfaced publicly. Expensive attorneys transformed betrayal into negotiation. Somewhere deep inside himself, Daniel genuinely believed Eleanor no longer possessed the strength to challenge him. He saw her as emotionally dependent on the life he created, too accustomed to comfort and routine to risk destroying the empire surrounding them. But Eleanor already knew something Daniel had failed to understand. The empire surrounding him no longer belonged entirely to him. While Daniel casually flipped through documents, Eleanor watched carefully as his fingers brushed past sections he failed to review properly. Appendix C: International Holding Entities. Dormant Trust Structures. Voting share redistribution language connected to overseas subsidiaries created during Whitmore Global's aggressive expansion years earlier. The terminology appeared dense enough to discourage close attention, especially from executives accustomed to signing hundreds of corporate documents every month. Daniel barely slowed down while reading those sections because he trusted his own power too completely to imagine danger hidden inside legal language. Eleanor noticed everything: the slight impatience in his breathing, the confidence in the way he initialed pages without pausing, the certainty radiating from him like heat. Daniel believed tonight marked the conclusion of an inconvenience. Eleanor understood it as the opening move of something much larger. The champagne finally arrived halfway through the signing process. Daniel poured himself a glass without offering Eleanor one. Rain rattled softly against the windows while his attorney pointed toward the final signature pages waiting near the bottom of the folder. Daniel removed his Montblanc pen slowly, almost ceremonially, then loosened his tie as though relaxing after a successful negotiation. The scratching sound of ink against paper filled the room with strange intensity. Signature after signature, initial after initial. Daniel signed confidently because powerful men rarely imagine the trap exists until the mechanism has already closed around them. Eleanor never once interrupted him. She simply watched while condensation slid down the side of Daniel's untouched champagne glass. Somewhere downstairs, Vanessa Cole smiled at a message appearing on her phone from a friend asking if the divorce was finally over. Vanessa typed back only 3 words: "Almost there now." Upstairs, Daniel signed another page connected to dormant voting structures attached to Whitmore Global's European subsidiaries. Then another involving legacy trust entities established during attacks restructuring nearly 14 years earlier. His attorney briefly mentioned the language governing inactive holding shares before Daniel waved dismissively and continued signing. Eleanor lowered her eyes toward the paperwork for the first time in several minutes. That movement lasted less than a second, but later one attorney would privately admit it was the exact moment he realized something felt deeply wrong. Final signature took longer than expected. Daniel paused just long enough to stretch his fingers before pressing the pen against the paper one last time. The scratching sound seemed louder this time: final, permanent, binding. Eleanor watched him complete the signature with an expression impossible to read fully. Not sadness, not anger, something colder than either emotion. When Daniel finally placed the pen down against the table, he exhaled deeply like a man convinced he had escaped something heavy. His attorney collected the documents carefully while another lawyer confirmed timestamps and witness signatures. Eleanor stood first, smoothly, calmly. She gathered her coat without looking at Daniel immediately. Then she finally spoke again. "Goodbye, Daniel." No emotion attached to the words, just certainty. Daniel gave a small laugh under his breath after she walked toward the exit. Not cruel exactly, more relieved. Like someone finally closing a chapter he considered exhausting. The doors shut quietly behind Eleanor as she disappeared into the hallway without looking back once. Less than 30 seconds later, Daniel reached for his phone and texted Vanessa Cole 3 simple words: "It's done." Downstairs, Vanessa smiled immediately after reading the message. But across the street from Whitmore Tower, parked beneath the glow of rain-covered streetlights, a black SUV remained motionless with its engine running. Inside sat a forensic accountant named Richard Hale with a secured laptop balanced across his knees. Beside him rested several folders stamped with confidential federal markings connected to Whitmore Global's ongoing financial investigation. Richard's phone rang once. He answered without taking his eyes off the illuminated tower windows above Manhattan. A voice on the other end asked only one question: did he sign? Richard looked toward the entrance where Eleanor Whitmore had just stepped into the rain alone. Then he answered quietly, "Yes." Daniel Whitmore woke the next morning believing the hardest part of his week was already behind him. The rain had stopped sometime before sunrise. leaving Manhattan wrapped in that strange silver-gray stillness that settles over the city after a storm. From the windows of his penthouse overlooking Central Park, everything appeared clean, controlled, and exactly where it belonged. Vanessa Cole slept beside him while financial news murmured softly from a television mounted across the bedroom wall. Nothing looked different yet. No headlines, no scandal, no disaster waiting outside his door. Daniel poured himself coffee while checking overnight market reports, already shifting mentally back into business mode. Years earlier, divorce might have emotionally shaken him, but Daniel Whitmore had trained himself to compartmentalize pain the same way corporations isolate liabilities. Marriage was over, problem solved. That was how he viewed things. By 7:30 that morning, his driver was already cutting through midtown traffic toward Whitmore Global headquarters, while Daniel responded to emails from European investors, completely unaware that the empire surrounding him had quietly started moving beneath his feet. The first sign something was wrong came the moment Daniel entered the executive lobby. Usually employees greeted him instantly. Assistants straightened posture when he walked past. Conversations stopped. Fear followed him naturally through the building because fear had become part of Whitmore Global's culture under his leadership. But this morning felt different in ways difficult to explain immediately. People looked away too quickly. Conversations stopped too suddenly. Two senior analysts near the elevators went silent the second Daniel approached, then pretended to study documents they were clearly no longer reading. Daniel noticed it immediately because powerful men survive by sensing weakness and tension around them. Still, he ignored the feeling at first, until his executive keycard malfunctioned outside the private elevator reserved exclusively for senior leadership. Daniel stared at the red access light blinking against the panel, visibly irritated. He tried again. Another red flash. One of the security staff rushed over nervously before apologizing and blaming a system synchronization issue connected to overnight server maintenance. Daniel said nothing, but something cold shifted slightly in his chest for the first time since signing the divorce papers. Upstairs, the atmosphere inside Whitmore Global's executive floor felt even stranger. Daniel's longtime assistant avoided direct eye contact while handing him his morning schedule. Board members gathered near conference rooms lowered their voices as he approached. Phones stopped ringing the moment he entered certain hallways. Daniel walked quickly toward his office, irritation growing sharper with every passing minute. Then he noticed something else. The market screens outside the trading division showed unusual fluctuations connected to Whitmore Global stock activity before opening bell. Nothing catastrophic yet, just movement. Strange movement. Enough to trigger instinctive concern in a man who spent 3 decades reading financial behavior like weather patterns. Inside his office, Daniel immediately called the company's chief financial officer, demanding explanations for the frozen transfers flagged overnight by compliance teams. The CFO sounded nervous in ways Daniel had never heard before. 3 international accounts connected to Whitmore Global's European subsidiaries had been temporarily restricted pending federal review. Daniel assumed it was routine regulatory interference until he heard another sentence that stopped him completely. "Sir, the requests came through legal authorization tied to Eleanor Whitmore's holding entities." For several seconds, Daniel genuinely believed he had misheard him. Eleanor's holding entities. The phrase sounded absurd. Eleanor had no operational authority inside Whitmore Global anymore. At least that was what Daniel believed. But within the next hour, fragments of truth began arriving one piece at a time like shattered glass sliding across a table. Eleanor Whitmore controlled 49% of Whitmore Global's voting shares through a network of dormant holding structures quietly attached to international subsidiaries created during the company's aggressive expansion years. Intellectual property trusts connected to logistics software patents, European distribution entities, shipping route licensing agreements, legacy restructuring clauses buried inside old acquisition paperwork Daniel approved without review years earlier. Every piece had been assembled slowly, legally, and almost invisibly over more than a decade. Daniel built Whitmore Global publicly. Eleanor engineered its foundation privately. That realization hit him harder than any financial loss ever could because it forced Daniel to confront something unbearable to his ego. Eleanor had not simply endured his empire. She understood it better than he did. By late morning, Whitmore Global no longer felt like a corporation. It felt like a crime scene waiting for investigators to arrive. SEC inquiries began circulating internally regarding offshore transfers connected to shell corporations operating through Luxembourg and Singapore. Compliance officers suddenly demanded access to archived financial records from acquisitions completed nearly 8 years earlier. Anonymous whistleblower accusations appeared online claiming Whitmore Global manipulated international tax exposure through fraudulent consulting agreements. Then came the leaked emails. Internal messages between senior executives discussing hidden revenue transfers surfaced across multiple financial news platforms within hours. Daniel's legal team scrambled to contain the damage, but every answer seemed to uncover another problem buried beneath it. News outlets started describing Whitmore Global not as a successful corporation, but as a company under siege. Employees panicked quietly across trading floors, while investors flooded executive offices demanding explanations. Through all of it, Eleanor Whitmore remained completely silent publicly. That silence became more terrifying with every passing hour because Daniel slowly realized the collapse unfolding around him did not feel random. It felt organized. Then came the revelation that changed everything. Around 28 minutes into the unraveling of Daniel Whitmore's life, his attorney uncovered archived correspondence connected to Eleanor's long-term restructuring agreements. Hidden among legal memos and dormant trust filings sat evidence proving Eleanor knew about Vanessa Cole years before the affair became public inside Whitmore Global. Hotel receipts, private flight records, expense reports rerouted through executive accounts. Eleanor had known. Not for months, for years. Daniel sat frozen inside his office while reading the files because the realization shattered every assumption he made about his marriage. Eleanor had not remained silent because she was weak. She remained silent because leaving too early would have destroyed the long-term corporate restructuring plan she spent years constructing quietly behind the scenes. If she divorced Daniel before the international holdings matured, she risked losing leverage over Whitmore Global's voting structures. So she waited, patiently, carefully. While Daniel publicly humiliated her, Eleanor slowly secured legal control over pieces of the empire he believed belonged entirely to him. That discovery transformed the entire story surrounding Whitmore Global from a billionaire divorce into something much colder and far more calculated. And still the revelations kept coming. Every few minutes another hidden detail surfaced. A secret consulting payment tied to a senator under federal review. Internal auditors discovering missing funds routed through offshore partnerships. Executives privately contacting Eleanor's attorneys behind Daniel's back. Even Vanessa Cole started disappearing from the executive floor after reporters began contacting employees about leaked communications between her and Daniel. Paranoia spread through Whitmore Global like electrical fire inside a skyscraper. Nobody knew who was cooperating with investigators anymore. Nobody knew which documents were compromised. Daniel stopped trusting nearly everyone around him because every hallway conversation suddenly felt loaded with hidden meaning. The empire he spent 30 years building was no longer collapsing from outside pressure alone. It was collapsing from internal betrayal, carefully prepared long before Daniel ever signed those divorce papers. By evening, emergency board members arrived at Whitmore Global headquarters through a private underground entrance, while reporters gathered outside the building behind police barricades. Daniel moved through the hallways surrounded by attorneys, demanding explanations nobody could fully provide fast enough. He still believed he could regain control somehow because men like Daniel Whitmore survive psychologically by believing dominance can always be restored. But when he entered the executive boardroom, the atmosphere inside felt colder than anything waiting outside in Manhattan that night. Several board members refused to meet his eyes directly. Others looked at him with something almost resembling pity. At the far end of the table sat board chairman Arthur Bennett, a man who had worked beside Daniel for over 20 years. Arthur slowly removed his glasses before speaking carefully into the silence hanging over the room. "Daniel," he said quietly, "you're no longer majority control." For nearly a week after the emergency board meeting, financial media treated the collapse of Whitmore Global like another billionaire scandal driven by divorce, infidelity, and greed. Reporters framed Eleanor Whitmore as the quiet wife who finally snapped after years of humiliation. Headlines focused on Vanessa Cole, leaked executive emails, and Daniel Whitmore's public downfall because those stories were easier to sell, easier to understand. America has always loved watching powerful men lose control in dramatic ways. But behind closed doors, federal investigators and senior attorneys working the case had already started realizing something far more complicated was unfolding beneath the surface. Eleanor Whitmore had not spent 15 years quietly preparing a divorce revenge plan. She had spent 15 years preparing for a corporate disaster she believed Daniel Whitmore would eventually create himself. That distinction changed everything. The first major breakthrough came through forensic accountant Richard Hale, the same man sitting inside the black SUV the night Daniel signed the divorce papers. Federal investigators originally brought Hale into the Whitmore Global inquiry after irregular financial movements triggered automated compliance alerts tied to overseas subsidiaries. At first, investigators suspected ordinary corporate tax manipulation, the kind massive companies bury beneath armies of attorneys every year. But once Hale gained access to internal holding structures connected to Eleanor Whitmore's dormant trust agreements, a much larger pattern began emerging. Fraudulent shell corporations operating through Malta and Luxembourg. Offshore transfers routed through consulting firms that technically did not exist. Political lobbying payments disguised as logistics infrastructure grants. Entire networks of money movement hidden beneath layers of international restructuring agreements Daniel Whitmore barely remembered approving. The deeper Hale investigated, the clearer one terrifying truth became. Whitmore Global was no longer simply aggressive in business. It had crossed legal lines repeatedly over several years, and Eleanor Whitmore had been documenting it almost the entire time. What stunned investigators most was not the scale of the corruption. It was Eleanor's patience. Long before federal agencies officially opened inquiries into Whitmore Global, Eleanor had already assembled a private network of people quietly monitoring the company from inside. Attorneys specializing in corporate fraud, compliance officers alarmed by executive behavior, board members increasingly disturbed by Daniel's recklessness. Even outside auditors who privately warned that Whitmore Global's international structure had become dangerously unstable. Eleanor maintained contact with all of them carefully over the years without drawing attention to herself. She never moved emotionally, never reacted impulsively. Every conversation, every document, every hidden agreement served a purpose larger than revenge. Because somewhere along the way, Eleanor realized something Daniel never did. Whitmore Global was becoming too dangerous to survive under his control. And yet, Eleanor still protected him longer than most people realized. Internal records later showed Eleanor quietly prevented multiple whistleblower complaints from going public years earlier, because exposure at the wrong moment could have destroyed thousands of employee pensions tied to Whitmore Global stock. She rerouted financial protections through trust structures to shield retirement accounts from potential collapse. She privately pressured board members to reject some of Daniel's most reckless expansion deals without revealing her reasons publicly. Even after discovering Daniel's relationship with Vanessa Cole, Eleanor stayed. Not because she lacked dignity, not because she was emotionally weak, but because leaving before securing legal control over key voting structures would have handed Whitmore Global entirely to a man she no longer trusted morally or financially. That revelation shifted public perception dramatically once portions of the investigation leaked to the media. Eleanor Whitmore was no longer viewed as a billionaire's discarded wife. She became something far more complicated, a woman who quietly positioned herself between a collapsing empire and the innocent people trapped beneath it. Daniel Whitmore struggled to understand that version of the story because it forced him to confront truths about himself he spent decades avoiding. For years, Daniel believed the destruction of his marriage centered around betrayal and loyalty. He blamed Eleanor's emotional distance. He blamed success. He blamed routine. Eventually, he blamed Vanessa Cole because it felt easier than examining his own reflection honestly. But as investigators reconstructed the final decade of Whitmore Global's internal operations, another reality slowly emerged. The marriage was not destroyed by infidelity alone. Vanessa Cole merely exposed cracks already spreading beneath the surface for years. The real damage came from Daniel's obsession with legacy, his hunger for expansion, his refusal to believe rules applied to him anymore. Success transformed Daniel Whitmore into the exact kind of man he once hated growing up poor in Newark, a man who believed power justified everything, a man who measured human worth through usefulness, a man who stopped seeing people clearly once they no longer fed his ambition. Court proceedings began quietly but carried the atmosphere of a political scandal rather than a divorce case. Federal attorneys entered lower Manhattan courthouses through underground entrances while reporters crowded behind steel barricades outside. No screaming matches, no theatrical confrontations, just controlled destruction unfolding one document at a time. Stock graphics flashed red across financial news broadcasts, while analysts debated whether Whitmore Global could survive the investigation surrounding it. Camera flashes exploded outside courthouse entrances whenever Daniel Whitmore appeared surrounded by legal teams and exhausted executives. Inside hearing rooms, testimony unfolded almost entirely in hushed voices. Compliance officers explained hidden transfer structures. Auditors described pressure from senior leadership to manipulate exposure reports. Former executives quietly admitted Daniel approved international partnerships without proper legal review. Through all of it, Eleanor Whitmore rarely spoke publicly. She attended proceedings dressed in dark neutral colors, sitting silently beside attorneys while reporters searched her face for emotion she refused to display. Then came the revelation nobody expected. Even after gaining effective control over Whitmore Global, Eleanor Whitmore never intended to keep the empire permanently. Investigators discovered restructuring plans showing Eleanor planned to dismantle portions of Whitmore Global's most legally compromised divisions almost immediately after securing voting authority. Her long-term strategy focused on stabilizing employee pensions, protecting legitimate assets, and separating lawful operations from the corruption Daniel allowed to spread through the company. Eleanor did not spend 15 years preparing to steal Daniel Whitmore's empire. She spent 15 years preparing to save what remained of it before federal collapse destroyed everyone connected to it. That truth landed harder than any courtroom verdict because it completely reversed the story people thought they understood. Daniel Whitmore believed Eleanor stayed because she needed him. In reality, Eleanor stayed because Whitmore Global needed protection from the man running it. By the beginning of winter, Daniel Whitmore's collapse was complete. Not sudden, not explosive, something colder than that. The kind of collapse that happened slowly enough for a man to watch every piece of his identity disappear one layer at a time. Whitmore Global's board officially voted to remove him from operational leadership after federal investigations expanded into multiple international divisions connected to the company's offshore network. The announcement arrived through a carefully worded press release just before markets opened on a Monday morning. the same way corporations quietly bury bad news when they want panic controlled. Daniel read the statement alone inside his penthouse office, while Manhattan disappeared beneath heavy snowfall outside the windows. After 30 years of commanding boardrooms, politicians, investors, and entire industries, he was no longer even allowed inside the executive floors of the company carrying his own name. Security access revoked, authority stripped, publicly described as a former strategic advisor pending regulatory review. Corporate language has a unique way of turning powerful men into ghosts while pretending to remain respectful. Then came the destruction of his public image. Financial networks that once celebrated Daniel Whitmore as a self-made genius now replayed archived interviews beside headlines discussing corruption, fraud investigations, and executive misconduct. Former allies distanced themselves almost overnight. Politicians returned campaign donations tied to Whitmore Global. Investors who once fought for meetings with Daniel suddenly claimed they had concerns about his leadership for years. Even business publications that once called him visionary started publishing anonymous accounts describing his arrogance, intimidation tactics, and obsession with control. The humiliation spread beyond Wall Street quickly because America enjoys watching powerful men fall almost as much as it admires them rising. Daniel could not escape it anywhere. Restaurants lowered their voices when he entered. Former colleagues stopped returning calls. One longtime executive privately described the atmosphere surrounding Daniel as social quarantine. Nobody wanted proximity to a collapsing empire once federal investigators became involved. Vanessa Cole disappeared before the investigations reached their peak. At first, reporters followed her aggressively. After leaked internal messages exposed the extent of her relationship with Daniel Whitmore during the final years of his marriage. News outlets framed her as everything from manipulative opportunist to corporate accomplice, depending on which narrative generated more outrage that week. But Vanessa herself seemed completely unprepared for what life looked like once Daniel Whitmore stopped being untouchable. Luxury gifts disappeared under legal review. Private access vanished. Invitations stopped arriving. Within months, Vanessa quietly relocated to Miami and avoided public appearances entirely. Daniel attempted contacting her repeatedly during the early stages of the collapse, but according to records later discussed privately during hearings, most of those messages went unanswered. For the first time in decades, Daniel Whitmore experienced something completely unfamiliar to him: abandonment. Yet the most devastating betrayal came not from Vanessa or federal investigators. It came from the realization that many people closest to him had already shifted loyalty toward Eleanor Whitmore long before the public collapse began. Board members cooperated with restructuring efforts. Attorneys once loyal to Daniel negotiated privately with Eleanor's legal team. Senior compliance officers openly supported the dismantling of compromised divisions inside Whitmore Global. Even employees throughout the company slowly stopped speaking about Eleanor as though she were merely Daniel's former wife. They started referring to her differently, quietly, respectfully, sometimes almost protectively, because as investigations continued, more details emerged about the actions Eleanor took years earlier to shield ordinary employees from the consequences of Daniel's recklessness. Retirement protections hidden inside trust structures. Emergency pension reserves secured through dormant subsidiaries. Healthcare protections preserved despite massive internal instability. People realized Eleanor Whitmore had spent years preparing not only for Daniel's downfall, but for the survival of everyone standing beneath the empire when it collapsed. Then came the final revelation that transformed the entire story from scandal into something almost mythic in the eyes of the public. Investigators uncovered several hidden financial reserves Eleanor Whitmore quietly secured through international holding entities years earlier. Media outlets initially assumed the money represented personal wealth she intended to protect during the divorce. But weeks later, Eleanor shocked both federal regulators and financial analysts by redirecting the majority of those funds into three separate initiatives. The first established long-term funding for veteran rehabilitation hospitals across multiple states. The second created a National Cancer Research Foundation, specializing in treatment accessibility for lower-income families. And the third secured employee pensions connected to Whitmore Global workers whose retirement savings would have otherwise collapsed during the company restructuring process. The numbers stunned people. Hundreds of millions redirected quietly without publicity campaigns or press conferences celebrating generosity. No emotional interviews. No attempts to publicly humiliate Daniel. Just action. Calm, precise, permanent. That was the moment public perception shifted completely. Eleanor Whitmore stopped being viewed as the woman who destroyed a billionaire. She became the woman who prevented thousands of innocent people from being destroyed alongside him. Late one December evening, nearly a year after signing the divorce papers, Daniel Whitmore sat alone inside the same penthouse where he once believed wealth could protect him from consequences forever. Snow drifted quietly beyond the windows while muted television coverage flickered across the dark living room. His hair looked grayer now, his posture heavier. On the television screen, reporters stood outside the opening ceremony of a newly completed veteran rehabilitation center funded through the Whitmore Foundation. The anchor's voice carried softly through the room. The Whitmore Foundation announced today that additional funding will be allocated toward cancer treatment programs and employee recovery assistance tied to the Whitmore Global restructuring effort. Daniel stared silently at the screen while footage showed Eleanor Whitmore walking through a hospital wing beside doctors, veterans, and families. No designer spotlight, no triumphant speech, no visible satisfaction. Just calm dignity moving quietly through rooms filled with people whose lives would change because of decisions she made years earlier in complete silence. That image seemed to affect Daniel more deeply than losing the company itself. Because for the first time, he fully understood the difference between building power and deserving it. And perhaps that was always the real story hidden beneath the collapse of Whitmore Global. Daniel Whitmore spent his entire life believing power meant ownership. Ownership of companies, ownership of wealth, ownership of people. He believed success came from commanding rooms loudly enough that nobody questioned your authority. But the one thing Daniel never truly understood was that the people who quietly hold everything together are often the people capable of taking everything apart. Even now, years after the collapse of Whitmore Global, people still argue about what really happened between Daniel Whitmore and Eleanor Whitmore. Some believe Eleanor was completely justified after decades of emotional neglect, humiliation, and betrayal. Others believe she crossed a line by secretly positioning herself against her own husband for years, while quietly building control over the empire they created together. Because the truth is, stories like this rarely leave behind simple heroes and villains. Daniel Whitmore was arrogant, emotionally distant, and dangerously obsessed with power, but he also built something extraordinary from almost nothing. Thousands of employees fed their families because Whitmore Global existed. Entire industries depended on the company's success. And Eleanor Whitmore, despite ultimately protecting pensions, hospitals, and innocent workers, still spent years preparing for a collapse she never warned Daniel about directly. That moral complexity is exactly why the story continues haunting people long after the headlines disappeared. Some former Whitmore Global employees later admitted they viewed Eleanor almost like a silent guardian protecting the company from Daniel's recklessness. Others privately believed Daniel became the victim of a carefully constructed emotional and financial trap. And perhaps the most unsettling part of the entire story is this. Both perspectives contain pieces of truth, because power changes people slowly. It isolates them. It convinces them they are untouchable. Daniel Whitmore believed control meant dominance over everyone around him, while Eleanor Whitmore understood something much quieter and far more dangerous. Real control often belongs to the person nobody notices preparing in silence. By the time Daniel realized that truth, the signatures were already permanent, the investigations were already moving, and the empire carrying his name no longer truly belonged to him. So now the question passes to you. Did Eleanor Whitmore go too far? Was Daniel Whitmore a victim of manipulation? Or did his own arrogance destroy everything he spent 30 years building? And if you discovered your spouse secretly controlled half your company while quietly documenting your every mistake for over a decade, what would you do? Let us know your thoughts down in the comments, because stories like this reveal far more about human nature than they do about money alone. And if you thought this billionaire downfall was unbelievable, wait until you hear about the CEO who discovered his missing wife had been living under a completely different identity for 11 years, while hiding millions through a private art foundation nobody knew existed. That story changed an entire family forever. Subscribe for more true-style stories of power, betrayal, revenge, and the secrets people hide behind billion-dollar empires.